By the winter of 1820, the mountains had already taken everything from 13-year-old, his family, his home, even his name. But when he found the man who'd burned his cabin still walking free in the holler, he learned the hills hadn't taken his fire after all. They'd been feeding it. The morning mist clung to the hollows like spectral fingers when 15-year-old Ezra Thorne watched his world burn. He'd been checking the trapline his father had set along Bitter Creek, a good 2 miles from their cabin, when he first smelled the smoke. Not the clean smell of chimney smoke or the sharp scent of a brush fire, but something darker, thicker, with an undertone that made his stomach clench even before his mind could name it. He dropped the 2 rabbits he'd been carrying and ran. His bare feet knew every root and stone of that mountain path. He'd walked it since he was old enough to toddle behind his father, learning which plants would heal and which would kill, where the good fishing holes hid, how to read the scratch marks on bark that told you a bear had passed. The Thornes had lived in these Kentucky mountains for 3 generations, carved out of the wilderness by his grandfather's grandfather, defended against Shawnee raids and winter starvation, and the general cruelty of a land that didn't give up its bounty easy. But all that history, all that blood and sweat and stubborn survival was going up in flames. Ezra burst through the tree line into the clearing where their cabin stood, or had stood. The roof had already collapsed inward, sending up a column of sparks that danced like demon fireflies against the grey morning sky. The henhouse was nothing but charred timber. Their milk cow lay on her side near the creek, throat cut, the water running pink downstream. "Ma! Pa!" The words tore from his throat raw and desperate. He started toward the cabin, but the heat drove him back, seared the hair on his arms, made his eyes water until he couldn't see. He circled around, calling for them, praying they'd gotten out, that they were hiding in the woods, that this was all some nightmare he'd wake from. That's when he saw his father. Samuel Thorne was hanging from the big oak tree at the edge of the clearing, the one Ezra had climbed as a boy, where his mother had pushed him on a rope swing. His father's face was purple, tongue protruding, eyes bulging. But it was his chest that made Ezra's knees buckle. It had been cut open, carved with something. Even from 20 feet away, Ezra could make out the shape, a crude letter, T. He vomited into the dirt, heaved until there was nothing left but bile and the taste of ash. "Ma," he whispered, forcing himself to look around. "Ma, where are you?" He found her near the spring house, or what was left of her. They'd been cruel. That was all his mind could process, all it would let him see, before something inside him shut down, locked away the details in a place he'd never fully open again. She'd been wearing her blue calico dress, the one she saved for Sundays. That's what he focused on, just that scrap of blue fabric, not the rest. Ezra knelt beside her, wanted to touch her hand, but couldn't make himself do it. His mother had been gentle, always humming old ballads while she worked, always quick with a smile, even after the hardest days. She'd taught him his letters from a Bible, so worn the pages were soft as cloth. She'd never hurt anyone in her entire life. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry." The sound of hoofbeats brought his head up. 4 riders emerged from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, taking their time, confident. Ezra recognized them all. Silas Blackwood rode in front on a big roan stallion that probably cost more than everything Ezra's family had owned combined. He was a thick man in his 40s, with grey short black hair and a beard trimmed neat in the style of wealthier men. He wore proper riding boots and a coat with brass buttons, and he sat his horse like a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Behind him rode his 3 sons. Marcus, the eldest at 22, with his father's heavy build and mean eyes. Jacob, 2 years younger and almost pretty if you didn't know the viciousness that lurked behind that smooth face. And Thomas, just turned 18, still growing into his height, with spots on his chin and something eager and terrible in the way he kept licking his lips. The Blackwoods owned everything worth owning in these mountains. They had the biggest house, sitting up on a cleared ridge like a white-painted declaration of dominance. They had the general store, the grist mill, the lumber operation. They had land grants going back to some connection with Virginia royalty that nobody quite understood, but everyone had to respect. And what they didn't own legally, they controlled through debt, intimidation, and selective enforcement of whatever laws happened to be convenient at the moment. "Well now," Silas Blackwood said, pulling his horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing. "Look here, boys, seems we missed one." Ezra stood slowly. His father's hunting knife was in his belt. He never went into the woods without it. His hand moved toward it, but Marcus Blackwood already had a rifle pointed at his chest. "I wouldn't," Marcus said, grinning, "though I'd welcome the excuse." "Why?" Ezra heard himself ask. His voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. "We never did nothing to you." Silas Blackwood dismounted, moved closer, keeping just out of knife range. He pulled a rolled paper from inside his coat and held it up. "This here's a deed, boy, a legal and binding deed to this property, signed over to me by your father 3 months back as collateral against his debts." "That's a lie. I have witnesses." Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your father borrowed money he couldn't repay. Seed money, supplies from the store, cash loans. It added up. When I came to collect yesterday, he got hostile, threatened me, said he'd never signed no deed, called me a thief and a fraud." He shook his head sadly, like he was talking about the weather turning bad. "Well, I couldn't let that stand now, could I? Man's got to protect his reputation and his property rights." "You murdered them." Ezra's hands were shaking. "You murdered my parents for land you don't even need. You got thousands of acres already." "I got thousands of acres because I understand something you mountain trash never will." Silas's voice went hard. "Everything's about land. Who owns it? Who controls it? Your grandfather should have sold to mine when he had the chance. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." He turned to his sons. "Jacob, burn the spring house. Thomas, check the barn foundation. See if there's anything worth salvaging." "What about him?" Marcus gestured with the rifle toward Ezra. Silas studied Ezra for a long moment, and something calculating moved behind his eyes. "He's just a boy, not even full grown yet, no threat to anyone." He raised his voice, making sure Ezra heard every word clearly. "But let me make something plain, son. Your parents are dead. This land is mine, legal and proper, recorded at the county seat. You got no home, no family, no claim to nothing. You're homeless now, you understand? And if you're smart, you'll move on, find yourself a new life somewhere else. Because if you cause me any trouble, if you go around telling lies about what happened here, if I even hear your name again," he paused. "Well, there's worse things than dying quick, like your pa did. There's ways of dying that take days, even weeks. You comprehend me?" Ezra said nothing. He was looking at his father, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. "I asked you a question, boy." Silas's voice cracked like a whip. "I comprehend you," Ezra whispered. "Good. Now get moving before I change my mind about showing mercy." Ezra walked. He didn't run, though every instinct screamed at him to bolt. He walked with his back straight, feeling their eyes on him, expecting a bullet between his shoulder blades at any second. He walked until he reached the tree line, then kept walking. Only when he was deep in the woods, when he could no longer see the smoke from his home, did he finally break into a run. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and then he collapsed into a hollow beneath an overhanging rock and curled into a ball and shook, not crying. Something had broken inside him that went deeper than tears. Just shaking, his mind replaying everything he'd seen, every detail, burning it into his memory like a brand. The sun moved across the sky. Ezra didn't move. Birds sang in the trees, unconcerned with human tragedy. A fox passed nearby, paused to look at him curiously, then trotted on. The afternoon grew hot, then began to cool toward evening. Finally, as shadows lengthened and the mountain darkness gathered, Ezra uncurled himself. His whole body ached, his throat was raw. But something had crystallized inside him during those hours of stillness, something cold and hard and utterly clear. He couldn't go to the law. The nearest sheriff was 40 miles away in Harlan, and everyone knew he was in Silas Blackwood's pocket. The circuit judge who came through twice a year. He stayed at the Blackwood house, drank Blackwood whiskey, probably received Blackwood bribes. There was no law in these mountains except what the Blackwoods said it was. He couldn't seek help from neighbors. The few families scattered through these hollows were either in debt to the Blackwoods or too scared to cross them. The Thorns had been well liked, but not well liked enough for anyone to risk their own families standing up to the most powerful clan in the county. He couldn't run away and start over somewhere else. Maybe in 10 years, maybe 20, he'd be able to think about that. But not now. Not with his parents unavenged, their murders unpunished, their killers walking free and laughing about it, which left only one path. Ezra stood up slowly, testing his legs. He was tall for his age, but skinny, all angles and joints, without his father's breadth or strength. He knew how to trap and hunt and survive in the woods, but he'd never been in a real fight, never faced down a grown man with violence in mind. He was nothing, nobody. A homeless boy with a knife and a burning need for justice that nobody else cared about. But he had advantages they didn't know about. He knew these mountains like the Blackwoods never would, knew every hidden path and secret cave and forgotten hollow. He was young enough that people wouldn't see him as a threat, small enough to slip through spaces where grown men couldn't follow. And he had nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous than all the Blackwoods' guns and money and influence combined. The thought calmed him, gave him something to focus on besides the howling grief that threatened to tear him apart. He'd start small, learn their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses, watch and wait and plan. The Blackwoods thought they'd snuffed out a problem this morning, but all they'd really done was create a ghost, something that could move through the mountains unseen, striking when they least expected it. His father had taught him patience. Rushing at a trapped animal gets you bit, Samuel Thorne used to say. But if you wait, watch, understand what it's thinking, you can take it clean and quick. Ezra would be patient. He'd watch, he'd learn, and when the time came, he'd make them understand what they'd done, make them feel every bit of the pain they'd caused. But first, he needed to survive. He made his way back toward what had been his home, moving carefully, staying in the deep woods where the shadows gathered thickest. The clearing was empty now. The Blackwoods had left, satisfied with their day's work. The cabin had collapsed into a pile of smoldering timber. His father still hung from the oak tree, dark against the darkening sky. Ezra couldn't leave him like that, couldn't leave either of them for the carrion birds and the wolves. He found a shovel that had been thrown clear of the cabin, its handle charred but usable. The ground was hard, full of rocks, and his hands blistered within the first hour. But he kept digging, chopping through roots, prying out stones, until he had a hole big enough for two. Cutting his father down was harder. He had to climb the tree, saw through the rope with his knife, ease the body down as gently as he could manage. His father felt lighter than he should have, like something essential had leaked out along with his life. Ezra tried not to look at his face, at the carved letter on his chest, just focused on the work, on doing this one last thing new. Wrapping his mother in a blanket took most of his courage. His hands shook so badly he could barely tie the knots. But he managed it, managed to drag both bodies to the grave, managed to lower them down as gently as he could. By the time he finished filling the hole, it was full dark. No moon yet, just stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Ezra patted the earth flat, then piled rocks on top to keep the animals out. He couldn't carve a proper headstone, didn't have the tools or the skill, but he found a flat piece of sandstone and used his knife point to scratch their names and the date. Samuel Thorne and Mary Thorne, May 15th, 1820. "I'm going to make this right," he whispered to the grave. "I swear it on my life, on everything we were. I'm going to make them pay for what they done." The words hung in the air, a promise made to the dead and to himself. Then he turned away from the only home he'd ever known and walked into the darkness. The first week was the hardest. Ezra had the clothes on his back, his knife, and nothing else. He built rough shelters each night, ate what he could trap or forage, drank from creeks. His stomach cramped with hunger. Mosquitoes fed on him until he looked like he had pox. He startled awake at every sound, sure the Blackwoods had changed their minds about letting him live. But he survived. And more than that, he learned. He learned he could move through the forest nearly silent when he needed to. Learned which caves were empty and which sheltered bears or wildcats. Learned to build a fire so small it gave no smoke, cook food that left no smell to draw attention. His father had taught him woodcraft, but survival on his own, with people actively wanting him gone, required a different kind of knowledge. The second week, he began watching the Blackwood house. It sat on a ridge overlooking the town of Coalmount, though calling it a town was generous. Maybe 50 buildings total, clustered around a crossroads where the main wagon trace met the path that led back into the deeper mountains. The Blackwood house dominated everything, a two-story structure with real glass windows and a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Behind it stood a barn, a smokehouse, a spring house, quarters for the workers and slaves they kept. Ezra found a spot on the ridge opposite, where a tangle of laurel and rhododendron grew so thick you could hide inside it and see out without being seen. He spent days there, learning routines. Silas woke early, took his coffee on the porch, surveyed his domain like a king. Marcus and Jacob worked the family's enterprises. Marcus overseeing the lumber operation, Jacob managing the store. Thomas, the youngest, seemed to have no particular job except trailing after his brothers and learning cruelty. They had house slaves, 2 women and an older man who did the cooking and cleaning. Field hands worked their land, some hired, some working off debts that would probably never be fully paid. Everyone moved around the Black Woods carefully, like they were stepping around coiled snakes, watching them live their comfortable lives, eating good food, laughing, carrying on like they hadn't murdered innocent people just for land they didn't need. Made something dark and bitter grow in Ezra's chest. It would have been easier if they'd been monsters all the time, if they'd looked evil. But they didn't. They looked normal. Marcus courted the blacksmith's daughter, brought her flowers, made her giggle. Jacob went to church on Sundays, sang hymns in a clear tenor voice. Even Thomas, for all his meanness, played with a hound puppy in the yard like any other boy. That's what made it worse somehow. They could be human when it suited them, could pretend to be decent, but underneath, they were something else entirely. The third week, Ezra started learning about the town itself. He'd been to Colmont before, of course, but always with his parents, always with a purpose. Selling furs, buying supplies, maybe attending the monthly preaching when a circuit rider came through. He'd never paid attention to the currents underneath, the way power flowed through the place. Now he watched from the woods at the edge of town, learning who mattered and who didn't, who was afraid and who thought they could get away with small rebellions. The storekeeper, a thin man named Jessup, kept 2 sets of books, one real, one for show. Ezra watched him through the back window, saw him moving numbers from one ledger to another, probably skimming profits before the Blackwoods got their cut. The blacksmith, a huge man named Garrett with arms like tree trunks, sometimes refused payment from the poorest customers, fixed their tools for free or for trade. His daughter, the one Marcus courted, looked at her suitor with starry eyes and didn't see what lurked beneath. The widow Carson ran a boarding house and took in anyone who needed a bed, asked no questions, turned nobody away. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years back, and something about that loss had made her softer toward other people's suffering. And then there was Doc Brennan, the town's only physician, a man of maybe 60, with a shock of white hair and hands that trembled slightly until he got a drink in him. He'd studied medicine in Philadelphia before some scandal drove him west. Now he tended the sick and injured with skill, but without hope, like a man who'd seen too much of human cruelty to believe in healing anymore. These people, Ezra realized, were threads in the fabric of the town. If he wanted to take down the Blackwoods, he'd need to understand how that fabric was woven, where the weak points were, who might help if the risk wasn't too great. But that was thinking too far ahead. Right now, he just needed to survive and learn. One afternoon, hunger drove him to take a risk. He slipped into town just before dusk, when the light was failing and people were heading home for supper. The blacksmith shop was closed, but Garrett was still inside, banking his forge for the night. Ezra watched through a gap in the wallboards, waited until the big man turned his back, then darted in and grabbed a piece of scrap iron from the pile by the door. He almost made it out clean, but his foot caught on something, sent a pile of horseshoes clattering across the floor. Garrett spun around, grabbed him by the collar before Ezra could bolt. "What in the... You're the Thorn Boy." Ezra went still. This was it. Garrett would turn him over to the Blackwoods, and they'd finish what they'd started. But instead, the blacksmith's expression softened slightly. "Heard what happened. Terrible thing." He looked at the piece of iron in Ezra's hand. "What you need that for?" "Making a spear point," Ezra said, seeing no point in lying. "For hunting." Garrett studied him for a long moment. Then he let go of Ezra's collar and walked to a shelf, pulled down a proper spear point, leaf-shaped, beautifully balanced, with a socket for hafting. "Take this instead. That scrap wouldn't hold an edge worth a damn." Ezra stared at it. "I got nothing to pay you with." "Don't recall asking for payment." Garrett pressed the spear point into Ezra's hand. "You look half-starved, boy. When's the last time you ate something that didn't try to run away first?" "I'm managing." "That's not what I asked." Garrett moved to a cupboard, pulled out a wrapped bundle. "My wife made extra cornbread this morning. Take it." "Why are you helping me?" The question burst out before Ezra could stop it. "You know what the Blackwoods would do if they found out." Garrett's jaw tightened. "The Blackwoods don't own every person in this town, no matter what they think. Your father was a good man. Your mother was kind. What happened to them was wrong." He paused, seemed to be weighing something. "But boy, you need to understand. There's wrong, and then there's what a person can do about wrong. I got a wife, a daughter, a business. I can't stand up to the Blackwoods directly. Nobody here can. So if I give you a spear point and some bread, that's the extent of what I can offer. You comprehend?" "I comprehend," Ezra said quietly. "Good. Now get out of here before someone sees you." But as Ezra turned to go, Garrett added, "The widow Carson's place. She's got a barn out back. Hasn't used it since her horse died. Nobody'd notice if someone slept there now and then. Just saying." Ezra met his eyes, saw something there. Not quite hope, but maybe permission. Permission to survive, to exist on the margins, to be a ghost haunting the edges of Colmont. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, for the first time since the burning, Ezra slept in something like shelter. The widow's barn was dry and relatively warm, with old hay that made decent bedding. He ate the cornbread slowly, making it last, and attached the spear point to a straight ash sapling he'd been carrying, binding it tight with strips of bark. It made a good weapon, well balanced, the kind of thing that could bring down a deer if his aim was true. Or a man, his mind whispered. If it came to that. He pushed the thought away. That time would come, but not yet. For now, he just needed to survive, to watch, to learn everything he could about his enemies. The weeks became months. Summer heat settled over the mountains, thick and oppressive in the hollows. Ezra grew leaner, harder, his muscles adapting to the constant movement and sparse diet. His hair grew long and tangled. His clothes, already worn, became rags held together with thorns and hope. But he learned. He learned that Marcus Blackwood liked his drink and got mean when he had too much. That Jacob had a taste for married women and wasn't careful about it. That Thomas liked to hurt things smaller than himself. Animals when he could get away with it. Younger children when no one was watching. He learned the rotation of their patrols, the routes they rode when checking their various properties. He learned which roads were safe to cross and which ones meant risking exposure. He learned that some people in Coalmont quietly resented the Blackwoods' power. Others feared them but dreamed of their approval. A few, like the storekeeper Jessup, were already stealing from them in small ways. Acts of petty rebellion that salved their consciences without risking real consequences. And he learned that he himself was becoming something different than the boy he'd been. Something colder, more patient, harder to kill. The mountains were forging him into a new shape, tempering him like steel. One evening in late July, Ezra was checking his snares near Broken Ridge when he heard riders coming. He slipped into the brush, went still and silent like his father had taught him. 3 horses passed within 20 feet, Marcus and Jacob Blackwood, and a man Ezra didn't recognize. "Telling you the old fool's sitting on a fortune and doesn't even know it," the stranger was saying. "That land's got coal under it, good bituminous coal. Railroads coming through in the next 5 years. Mark my words. Whoever controls the coal rights will be set for life. So we encourage him to sell," Marcus said, "or we call in his debts, same as we did with the Thorn place. This one's different. Jedediah Hart's got no debts, lives too simple for that, and he's stubborn as a mule, but he's old, got no family except one daughter. Maybe we work that angle." Jacob laughed, and there was something ugly in the sound. "I like the way you think, Mr. Brenner." They rode on, their voices fading into the evening. Ezra stayed hidden until he was sure they were gone, his mind racing. Jedediah Hart. He knew that name, a hermit who lived way back in the deep mountains, kept to himself, bothered nobody. And he had a daughter. Ezra had seen her once or twice, a girl about his age with dark hair and darker eyes, who moved through the woods like she was part of them. The Blackwoods were planning something that would end with the Harts losing their land, maybe losing more than that. Ezra thought about it through the long night, argued with himself. It wasn't his business. He couldn't save everyone. He was just one boy against the most powerful family in the county, and he needed to focus on his own vengeance, not get distracted trying to be a hero. But by morning, he knew what he had to do. Because if he let the Blackwoods destroy another family without even trying to warn them, then he was no better than the cowards in Coalmont who turned away from his parents' murder. He headed into the deep mountains, following paths that most people had forgotten existed, moving steadily west and north toward the place where Jedediah Hart had built his hermitage. It took 2 days of hard walking. The trail grew fainter as he climbed, until it was barely there at all. But Ezra pushed on, driven by something he couldn't quite name, part obligation, part defiance, part need to prove he was still capable of caring about something other than revenge. He found the Hart place just as evening was falling on the second day. It was a small cabin tucked into a hanging valley, surrounded by chestnuts and oak, with a clear spring bubbling up nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney. A small garden grew behind the cabin, neat rows of beans and squash and corn. before Ezra could announce himself, a voice called out from somewhere above him. "That's far enough, stranger. State your business or move along." Ezra froze. Slowly, carefully, he looked up. The girl sat on a tree branch about 15 feet above his head. A Pennsylvania rifle pointed steadily at his chest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid, and her eyes watched him with complete calm. No fear at all. She looked comfortable up there, like she'd spent half her life in trees. "I'm Ezra Thorne," he said, making no sudden moves. "I come to warn your father. The Blackwoods are planning something." "The Thornes?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Heard about what happened to your family. Terrible thing." No sympathy in her voice, just fact. "How do I know you're not working for them now? Wouldn't be the first time they tried to get someone inside." "Because they murdered my parents and burned my home." The words came out flat, empty of emotion. "Because I watched my father hang from a tree, and my mother. Because I'm never gonna work for them. Not if I live 100 years. Something shifted in her expression. "Lower your hands. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already." Ezra lowered his hands slowly. The girl swung down from the branch in one fluid motion, landing light as a cat. Up close, he could see she was about his age, maybe a bit younger, but there was nothing childish about her. She moved with economy and grace, rifle always in position to swing up if needed. "Tell me about this plan," she said. So Ezra told her everything he'd overheard. The Colwrights, the stranger named Brenner, the intention to force her father into selling or losing the land. She listened without interrupting, her face giving nothing away. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then, "Wait here." She disappeared into the cabin. Ezra stood in the gathering dusk, listening to crickets chirp and an owl hoot somewhere in the darkening forest. He was suddenly aware of how tired he was, how hungry, how much he'd walked, and how little he'd eaten. The girl emerged with an old man beside her. Jedediah Hart, Ezra presumed. He was tall and gaunt, with a prophet's beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen things most folks couldn't imagine. He studied Ezra for a long moment. "You look half dead, boy." "I'm managing." "That's twice I've heard that lie today," a voice said from behind Ezra, making him jump. He spun to find the girl had somehow circled around behind him, silent as smoke. She grinned at his surprise. "Nobody who's really managing looks that close to falling over." "Sarah speaks true," the old man said. "Come inside, Ezra Thorne. Eat something, rest. Then we'll talk about what's to be done regarding these Blackwoods." Ezra hesitated. He'd been alone so long, had grown used to trusting nobody, that accepting help felt dangerous. But his body was screaming at him, and the smell of whatever was cooking inside the cabin made his mouth water. "All right," he said finally, "but just for tonight, I can't stay long." Sarah, her name was Sarah, he filed that away, snorted softly. "Nobody said anything about you staying, but Pa's right. Can't plan on an empty stomach, and yours sounds like it's been empty way too long." The cabin was small but clean, furnished simply with handmade furniture that spoke of skill and care. Jedediah ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to Ezra. Rabbit and wild onions and herbs Ezra couldn't identify, thick and savory, and the best thing he'd tasted in months. He had to force himself to eat slow, not wolf it down and make himself sick. While he ate, Jedediah and Sarah talked in low voices, discussing something. Finally, the old man turned to Ezra. "You've done us a service with this warning," he said, "and I'm not a man who forgets debts. So here's what I'm thinking. You need a place to hole up, somewhere safer than wherever you've been sleeping. And I need someone to help keep watch, someone young and quick, who knows how to move quiet through the woods. Sarah's good, but she can't be everywhere at once." "You're offering me a place here?" Ezra was stunned. "Temporarily," Sarah put in quickly. "Don't go getting comfortable. But yeah, until we sort out this Blackwood situation, you can stay. We got a loft, you can sleep there." Ezra looked between them, trying to understand. "Why? You don't know me. For all you know, I am working for them." "But you're not," Jedediah said simply. "I can see it in you, boy. You've got the look of someone who's been marked by grief and won't rest until it's answered. The Blackwoods made an enemy in you, and my enemy's enemy is, if not my friend, at least someone worth helping." And that's how Ezra Thorne, homeless boy and would-be avenger, found himself with allies for the first time since the burning. It was only temporary, he told himself, just until the Blackwoods made their move against the Hearts. Then he'd go back to his solitary vigil, his patient planning, his cold purpose. But as he climbed into the loft that night and lay down on a real mattress for the first time in months, he had to admit it felt good not to be completely alone. Dangerous, maybe. A weakness the Blackwoods could exploit if they learned about it. But good. He fell asleep to the sound of Sarah sharpening her knife somewhere below. A steady rhythmic scraping that spoke of discipline and readiness. The last thing he thought before sleep took him was that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this as he'd believed. The Blackwoods had made more than one enemy in these mountains, and enemies, when they came together, could be a terrible thing.